You want to message everybody loving at the meeting after?
I put it on a daily post that they're on the message.
Sweet. No, that's good. Right, man.
We're in.
We're in, and you can hear me okay.
Oh yeah, crystal clear.
All right, we got people joining us, which is great. We're on early to make sure we don't have any audio issues, video issues. We are ready.
Yeah, last time Houston and I did it, we cut it close, but it worked out.
We worked through always the first time webinar jitters,
Yeah,
blues, whatever we want to call it. So we got people joining us right now, which is great. If you'll notice as you're coming in, there's a chat on the side. Just kind of the first question, let us know your name, where you're watching from, listening in from. All the messages, by the way, are private. If you've been with us before, you know how that works, but feel free to throw it in the chat. It's also where we'll put questions during the webinar when Dr. Clayton Cook's presenting here, and then our goal today is to spend quite a bit of time answering questions and making it more interactive. So we got Jen from Massachusetts. Welcome. Linda, Montgomery, Alabama. We got Lisa. Is it Seguin, Texas ISD? Jamie from the Missouri School for the Deaf. Welcome. Morgan, high school counselor in Monmouth, Illinois. And there's Dara. Hi, Dara. From Maryland. We have people all over the country this morning. This is exciting. If you know anybody that you think would benefit, as we're still waiting to start here at the bottom of the hour, we always send out a replay link to these webinars, not only so that you can go back through if there's things that you want to watch or listen to again, but also if you're not able to make it live, even though we are recording it live, that's something that you can share at another time. So we're wanting to get good content resources in front of you, but even if you know you can't make it, you can always register and then we'll send you that follow-up video. Amy from Claiborne, Texas. Denise from Pullman, Washington. Hi, Tim, Tumwater High School, right here in Washington State, where I am. Clay, where are you at today? I know that you travel a lot. Are you in Minnesota?
Yep, Minneapolis. It's tropical out.
Is it? Has it warmed up at all?
Well, we're at 43 degrees and warming. So
that is tropical right now.
People are out in shorts.
I've been concerned about like track programs in the north, like that are like running in the snow, like snowshoes for the 100-yard. Their times are probably taking a hit.
Yeah, it's a different feel for track.
That's awesome. Ron from Missouri. So we got a good number of people jumping in here. We're going to get going right at the bottom of the hour. As you're putting your name, would love to throw out another kind of question starter today. And that is, like right now, if you had a question about behavior, what would it be? Like any question. It could be a scenario, could be big picture to ground level. Like I always loved in doing work together, Clay and I in the district that I was working in, one of the questions that kept coming up time and time again is, well, what if I have a student that goes under a desk and they won't come out? You know, so it could be very specific to a situation, or it could be more like systems work. But if you got any questions about behavior, what that could be a starter question. What would you throw in the chat? Remember, they're all private. We'll star so that we have during the time and get to the Q&A. I'll put some of these questions in front of Clay. And sometimes if we don't answer them live, we might follow up at a later time. But keep, if you're joining us here, keep putting where you're coming from. Annette, hi Annette, from Sumner. Jeanette, SWISD, elementary counselor. Someone said our track team is shoveling for practice today. That'd be a good workout.
For shot putters.
For shot putters for everybody. All right. see. All right, we're going to get going here in 1 minute. Keep letting us know where you're listening in from. We got team members who are going to be moderating, and so they may respond to some of the questions during what Clay's going to do is set up at the beginning, do a little instructional piece on prompt. We'll talk about that, and then we're going to try to leave quite a bit of time for questions as well. Virginia Marla from ESUHSDEV. You're going to have to tell me where that is. Evergreen Valley, that's exciting. We've already got at least our first question coming in, Clay. That's great. We'll star those. So once again, as you're listening here, if you have any question about behavior, what might it be? Feel free, as Clay's presenting, to be dropping questions in. We'll have time at the end, but I say we get going. Welcome everybody to the Carrick Strong webinar. Today, we're very excited to be having on for a second time Dr. Clayton Cook. I was jealous the last time because I was presenting in a school district and Houston got a host with Clay, but a good friend and someone who I greatly respect and doing amazing work across the country and even internationally. And so just excited to have you here, man, talking about the most exciting topic ever, and that is behavior. Because it is a hot topic. Wherever we go, it is. If we're talking school-wide climate and culture, we always define in our trainings, culture is behavior. It's how people actually behave repeatedly and habitually. And so if we're going to go after the work of increasing and improving our school culture and climate, we have to take a hard look at how we are better responding to, better dealing with our systems around behavior. And so today is specifically about how do we respond better to that problem behavior? Because as much as we want to be proactive, a lot of what comes at us is how we react. And so today, we've talked about this quite a bit, the prompt method. I'm hoping that you could take us through that, talk to us a little bit about that response to problem behavior, and then hopefully a great value add is to field some of the questions coming in today about behavior. So excited to have you, man. Thanks for coming back. That means that you had a good experience the first time.
Yep, totally. I'm glad to be back.
Awesome.
Well,
right in. Let's go.
Let's do this. The first thing we got to start out with, anytime we're talking about reacting to anyone's behavior, is to recognize that we can't make anybody do anything. There's nothing we can do to force someone to comply and do what we want them to do. So the things we do on the front end to build relationships, to create kind of a sense of trust and connection, are all facilitative of our reactive strategies. And too often we have adults in buildings trying to correct students' behavior for whom they've never spent any time on the front end building that relationship. Because you can imagine, I always create scenarios for people to think through kind of the implications of relationships for correcting behavior. You can imagine yourself being at a gas station and someone's doing something that you would like to correct. And if you, without relationship, and you went up to that person and corrected their behavior, they would look at you like a weirdo and you actually might have an altercation. So correcting behavior out of the context of relationship doesn't really work that well at any phase of life. So I just want to say that as a caveat before we kind of get into the meat of this. This is who I am. I'm an associate professor at the University of Minnesota. I think more important is the practical experiences that have given rise to my interests around promoting student social emotional well-being as part of the academic process. I was a paraprofessional, middle school math teacher, a school psychologist. I worked at Boys Town in Omaha, Nebraska, which is a residential treatment facility. I'm most proud of those experiences and my work with school systems across the country to get up and running effective supports, both proactively and reactively, to support student well-being in school. So that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, and Clay, and what I would say, just to give, I mean, and I think this is important, having worked in schools in a district for 15 years, and then obviously been in the work the past 20, that one of the things I think that people resonate most with you is that it is very evident that you have had that experience, because sometimes you might work with someone who's either consulting with a district or working with a district or working with teachers, and the theory comes across strong, like here's the research, here's this, but you get the sense that they have no idea what that the actual reality is in a classroom. And I've always appreciated that about you. And so I just want to give you that shout out with that. And I love hearing that that is what you're most proud of, because that comes through in the way that you present and the way that you support teams and districts across the country.
Yeah, I really pride myself on that. Too often researchers develop ideas or programs that will never, ever live in the real world. And it's because they're not spending time in the real world, in the trenches with people, educators, who are kind of on the front line, delivering supports and services to kids. So, I love this quote. If a child doesn't know how to read, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to multiply, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to drive, we teach. But if a child doesn't know how to behave, and here's the pause that a lot of people well, if they don't know how to behave, often what we see is ineffective responses that potentially create more harm than good. Yep. And that's through kind of punitive punishment types of sanctions in terms of removal or creating situations where kids are going to experience some type of psychological or emotional pain. So they reflect on their wrongs and their ways, and all of a sudden they transform as human, come back to us in kind of a better state. And unfortunately, we have over 4 decades of research to indicate that schools that adopt more punitive punishment-based methods in response to problem behavior produce worse outcomes in terms of school vandalism, student to teacher non-compliant, peer conflict, lower academic achievement. So any way we look at it, that if the punishment approach or the punitive approach isn't the route we want to pursue in schools when it comes to developing these kind of progressive, effective ways of responding to student behavior. So I like to think of, what first makes a behavior a problem. Mm-hmm. And maybe the best place to start is not even say what makes a behavior a problem, what's the definition of a problem? And so if you look at the definition of a problem, it is the discrepancy between what is expected and what someone's currently doing. So if you think from a developmental milestone perspective, there's certain developmental achievements that kids are supposed to reach. And if they don't reach those within timely limits, it means that there could be a developmental problem. For example, the kid's not speaking words, yet the developmental milestone suggests that they should be speaking. Speech is expected, but the person's not doing it, so we have a problem. In academics, we have standards, and that says what kids should be achieving academically at certain grades. And if a kid's falling behind, that would indicate that the kid has an academic problem. We need to mobilize supports to remediate that gap, if you will. However, in behavior, it gets a little bit tricky, because where do the expectations come from? Because in academics, we have standards. In development, we have milestones. But in behavior, the expectations are set by the adult. So this is where an adult can create the problem. So if I have overly rigid expectations, like sit down, be quiet, and don't move, anything that doesn't fit within that lens becomes a problem to me. And sometimes we have students who are in environments where the expectations are overly rigid, and a lot of students are looking like they have behavior problems. So we want to make sure first that the expectations are reasonable and developmentally appropriate and not culturally loaded. And there is a process to establish reasonable, non-culturally loaded, developmentally appropriate behavioral expectations. Because then behavior that deviates from that is considered a problem in that it could impact the learning environment or others. And so really a behavior becomes a problem due to its impact or its interference with kind of peace, harmony in the classroom or productivity. And that's why it would necessitate an adult reacting to it in a skillful way to get the behavior back on track. And so we're going to spend a lot of time thinking about when a behavior needs to get back on track, what are the methods that an adult could use in a very skillful and effective fashion to get the student's behavior back on track and plugged in to the learning environment, and ultimately meaning that it's not having a negative impact on self, others, or the learning environment more broadly. But a behavior really has an impact by 3 dimensions. So imagine a kid who blurts. Blurting once really doesn't, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't have a negative impact on learning, but it's the number of times a kid blurts that could then produce an impact on others. Or it could be how long something lasts. A student who talks to someone who they're seated next to about a topic that's unrelated to the academic topic at hand is actually normal behavior, because even well-functioning adults engage in that same behavior during professional development. However,
it never happens. Clay, that never happens.
Yeah, it never happens. No adults inappropriately use technology or talk off topic or blurt things or make weird noises. But the goal here is like to think about the duration could have a problem, have an impact on the environment. So someone could maybe talk for about 5 seconds and it wouldn't be a problem, but imagine someone who talks for 15 straight minutes, so the duration. And the last dimension of a behavior that could have an impact on the environment is the intensity of the behavior. And that's really kind of how loud, how disruptive, or potentially harmful the behavior is to others. So when we're gauging whether a behavior's a problem and necessitates a correction, we're wanting to make sure that the behavioral expectations are reasonable and developmentally appropriate. And then 2, we're really focused on the dimension of it that's creating a negative impact on self, others, or the learning environment. I always couch everything within this model. So let's imagine we consider problem behavior, and I'm just using that term to say a behavior that necessitates correction. No behavior comes out of thin air. There's always a match and there's always a source. So if we consider the problem behavior of fire, there's always a match or a source. The kid goes from not doing it and doing it. And to get on an upper hand in the future to prevent that behavior, we have to know what that kind of triggering antecedent is, what that match is. But there's also things going on in students' lives that are really important for us to recognize, like trauma, sleep deprivation, hunger, things that I consider lighter fluid. Lighter fluid itself doesn't create a fire, but it increases the likelihood that when you strike a match, you're going to get a fire. So lighter fluid are things that increase students' vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to potential matches where they would use problem behavior to get their needs met. So imagine a kid who's dealing with a lot of things outside of school, kind of chaotic home environment, not getting really good sleep and rest, and is tired, comes into school, and doing academic work could be the match, and the student engages in avoidance behaviors to avoid doing the work, and that's the reason why, but they engage in some unskillful behaviors. They first walk around the room, then when confronted by the teacher, they become confrontational and tell the teacher to back off, that they don't want to do it. Those are all behaviors the student's using to avoid academic work. So when we correct on the back end and we have a fire, it's really important for us to recognize that kids could have certain lighter fluid on us and they have certain vulnerabilities to matches that are occurring in the context of our class. And that gives us a depth of understanding. It can allow us to have some degree of compassion and empathy while we approach correcting the behavior. The next piece here is I want us to look at, from this model, we can think about putting in place proactive strategies. Those are things on the front end to prevent the occurrence of problem behaviors in the first place. Things like relationship are really good to wash lighter fluid off of kids, and they're also good to minimize potential matches that would otherwise provoke problem behavior. We can also use teaching strategies. That's teaching students self-regulation skills, teaching students specific behaviors they could use when confronted with certain situations. And then we still need reactive strategies, methods of responding and reacting to situations in which a problem behavior might arise. So when we're really supporting students, and if you can look at Character Strong, you'll see this, that there are proactive strategies that are kind of baked into it. There's teaching strategies as well as reactive strategies. And we're spending most of our time today on kind of that reactive strategy side of things. Now, I want to talk about adult self-regulation, because most of the time adults are responding to either their own child's, if they're a parent, problem behavior, or if they're an educator and they're responding to problem behavior. There's usually emotions on the line. And so adults become vulnerable to making or engaging in potentially unskillful reactions to the problem behavior. And there are certain vulnerable situations, or staff are, their decisions are vulnerable to certain things. And we know that things like lack of sleep, headache, not having enough food yet, anticipatory stress, or you're not well caffeinated yet, all create situations where the adults, when the student engages in a problem behavior, they're vulnerable to making less than stellar decisions in reaction to the student's problem behavior. So one of the things we do when we're working on effectively responding to student problem behavior is to recognize that behavior probably bugs you and gets something going on in you emotionally. And if you're not in a position to regulate those emotions, you could potentially say and do things that are unskillful and maybe make the situation worse than better, like harm a relationship or remove a kid from their learning environment too early and the kid loses instructional time. Or we do things that potentially stigmatize potential kids and they become recognized as bad or lazy and unmotivated kids, which then it has kind of a negative feedback loop onto that student. So we want to understand what are vulnerable decisions. So that same model that I showed you regarding students, we could flip it around and we can put the same model in adults, because we could come into school with anticipatory stress. Many educators feel like they've put a full day of work in while driving to school and they haven't even started yet. They've got their stress response already activated, or they can come into school tired. Now, unwanted student behavior is typically the educator's trigger or match. And if we're not careful and we don't regulate ourselves in the context of that, we could engage in a negative interaction that harms a relationship. We could remove the kid from the classroom way too early. And the reason why the adult would engage in those interactions is to get relief from the unwanted behavior. So there's a reason why the adult uses those potential unskillful behaviors to produce an outcome. So part of this whole process is to recognize, for adults to recognize, they need to increase their own self and emotional regulation in response to unwanted student behaviors that they can anticipate arising in the context of, a classroom or supervising hallways or whatever place or setting the adult is positioned to monitor and provide feedback to students based on their behavior.
So Clay, when you think about it too, even though with so much of this work, it seems like common sense, but that's a great paradigm shift. It's like that this work is as much for us, the adults, as it is the students. And I think about like another reminder in what you were just sharing on how important the self-care piece is for educators, as well as the reflective nature of why is it that I am responding in this way? What is it that is my triggers? What is triggering that? So I think that is so important that a lot of times it is our work that needs to be done way before any of the work that we're focusing on students, but yet we don't always have that luxury. If I'm a teacher, I'm teaching maybe right now, next period, in the next hour. So it has to happen hand in hand, but just how important the recognizing of that is, that this is as much for us as it is the students.
Yeah, to me, first it begins with kind of some degree of self-awareness, that you recognize, if we go back to the model here, that I actually have some lighter fluid on me as I'm entering in the school, and I need to do something. We call it a neutralizing routine. I need to do an activity or routine to essentially offset kind of my stress response. Or if I'm really fatigued and I'm kind of groggy and I don't feel like dealing with stuff, I need to do something to kind of get my energy level going up and do something. And that, it begins with self-awareness. And the next piece here really is about self-awareness of what are your own individualized matches? What are the things that students could do and say that would get you going and increase the likelihood you might react and respond in an unskillful way? Because part of one is knowing the skillful way to respond to behavior. The more challenging part is not knowing what to do, but actually doing it when your emotions are activated and you're bugged or annoyed or frustrated or offended by a particular behavior. And so part of that self-awareness is to recognize, and we help people explore, what are your matches? What are the things that students do that would trigger kind of an emotional response in you? And maybe you would respond to the student's behavior in a less than stellar manner. Then we have equity reflections, and this is where we get people to do a little bit deeper dive and to recognize that some of the inequitable outcomes we observe in schools may be due to how the adults are responding to certain behavior. So we have people reflect on, in what way are your matches related to things like gender? Is that match, that behavior, equally distributed across gender categories? And some people say, no, boys are more likely to do it. Then we say, okay, of the racial and ethnic groups, subgroups in your schools, is it equally distributed across that? And what people find is that there's certain subgroups of students who are more likely to engage in those behaviors, and they're more likely to get unskillful interactions from the adults. And how could those unskillful interactions impact students' sense of belonging to the classroom, their ability to stay plugged in, and ultimately kind of paint more potential negative experiences than positive experiences in school? So did you identify potential disparities? If so, how might those disparities be related to ongoing discipline disparities? Because one thing many schools are struggling with is persistent discipline disparities that impact particular subgroups of kids. And we often find like Black males are most vulnerable, but we also, other school systems, it's like Black Latino students with IEPs. And so when we have this reflection, it means we got to really mobilize our energy and effort to provide more skillful and effective responses to certain students' behavior, to continue to ensure that they feel like they belong, they're wanted members of the school, and we're turning those problem behaviors into learning opportunities rather than sanctioned punishment opportunities. So the prompt method, so we go here, we go and we have student behavior. We might have to regulate our emotions. Then people not only need to know to regulate self, they need to know what to do. There is an entire commercialized industry around different ways of correcting behavior. And I could list, 15 different named products that are essentially just methods of responding to behavior. And so there's a big, kind of training and technical assistance. What we find is those effective ones all boil down into the same type of components. They're progressive, meaning they're not just doing one thing. They kind of go from a less intensive to more intensive interaction. So you want to do kind of the lowest level strategy first, because the behavior is not really a big deal. Your goal is to get it back on track, all the way to something that might require a little more time and energy, but you're turning it, the incident of problem behavior, into a learning opportunity. So we've devised what we call the prompt method to be used and integrated into a variety of different approaches to talk about the sequence of practices. So the first, step we go over is really about proximity control. Proximity control, we know up to 50 to 60% of mild to moderate behaviors get corrected simply by the adult being near. And this doesn't mean being near and calling out the student. It's just simply their presence by the student is enough to be kind of a cue or a prompt to get the student back on track. The next thing we say is, if that's not effective, then you might need to use a redirection strategy. And a redirection strategy is a request or a directive from the adult where there's a high probability the student will say yes to it. And so you kind of break up the episode of any type of problem behavior, and the student complies with a high probability of compliance request. And so what we find, though, is educators need to kind of prefabricate their redirections, because in the moment, they might not be able to, generate these. So what we say is, come up with your redirections. and understand which types of redirections might work best for which types of students. So if you have students who have high energy levels and they like to move about, I'm for sure going to use a redirection strategy that's going to get that student up and move. And I might ask them to go do something or grab something for me and come back. And then we get them back plugged in. And so we often think there's non-instructional redirections as well as instructionally relevant redirection tactics that teachers or any educator could use to break up the episode of problem behavior and get the student's behavior back on track. So the next technique is what we call.
Sorry, but just because a lot of times we'll take this prompt method, which by the way, super powerful. I mean, we made a card of this method and literally one year put it in front of every single staff member, not just teacher, every single staff member in the district to remind them of a better way that we could be responding. And so many times these are reminders, but we need to be reminded more than we need to be taught. And I always somewhat joke, but not really, saying man, in the first 3 years as a classroom teacher, I had that proximity control down. And then it would have been a great reminder in year 4 when I started to get comfortable and I wasn't moving as much. But before you move on to ongoing monitoring, when you bring in redirection strategy, what is that percent? What does the research say that percent jumps up to with how much low level? Because you said, what was it? Upwards of even 50 to 60% with proximity.
With just proximity alone, we jump upwards to the 80, 85% correct. And now we're talking, you got of all the behaviors you would have to react to that would necessitate an adult doing something to kind of stop it and get the student back on track. We got 15% that we have to might need other strategies. But imagine going right away without proximity and you go straight to a warning to remove a kid, or you threaten to call their parents, or I write their name up on the board and I give it a check. The elementary example of this would be clips, and you demote the kid down from green, yellow, red to hell. The middle school and high school example of that is we write kids' names, we give them checks, and once you get 3 checks, you're out type of. But before you could just use proximity, and you don't even have to go to these heavy things that potentially might trigger a student's fight or flight response. So you add those first 2. The vast majority of things you're going to encounter are going to be wiped out with those 2 strategies alone. And you don't even need to take the time to engage in this lengthy dialogue because it doesn't require that.
So I just think and then sending you into the rest of this model that it's so important. Just pause there for a second and go, all right, what if we as a staff got laser focused on these 2? How much are these 2 strategies going to cost us? Well, in terms of money, 0. Right? In terms of intentional time, a little bit when it comes to the pre-thinking about the redirection strategies that I might use. But the payoff is huge. If you had a school-wide set of educators who got laser focused on coming back to and strengthening those 2 areas, and you had upwards of 80 to 85% of low-level behavior being taken care of with 2 strategies that you get laser focused on, that is low burden and high impact. Right? I think that is sometimes we jump right past. It's no, what if we just got really good at these 2? And we always share this model at our 1 and 2 day Character Strong trainings and just pause at that moment. And then it's okay, now let's move on to the other pieces. But just what would happen if we came back to and really got serious about improving our skill sets in those 2 areas? Not just me, but all of us, that tier 1 approach. So thank you for letting me pause there on those 2, because that's big, 80 to 85%.
Yeah, no, and I think the pause for people or the protected time to reflect on what would it look like in their environment to do these. And then, like I said, build out what is the redirection tactics going to look like for you. So in the moment, when a behavior necessitates that strategy, it's there. They've already built it out so they can fluently apply it, versus I have the idea of a redirection, but when I confront it, nothing's coming to mind and I'm getting frustrated and I end up doing something that maybe, triggers the kid and causes a negative kind of scene and interaction that ultimately might necessitate removing the kid from the environment, which is the thing we want to minimize to the maximum extent possible because of all the negative side effects.
Yep.
So, none of this is meant to be followed through robotically or rigidly. So sometimes the situation doesn't permit proximity control. or redirection, but it's on average, this is kind of the flow or the sequence of progressively responding. Ongoing monitoring, and many people know this as through kind of like social learning, that sometimes the best way to correct a given student's behavior and get it back on track is to recognize peers who are doing what you want the target student to do, and you recognize, reinforce, and show appreciation for those students doing. And you're not trying to rub it in and say, see, but you're just trying to capitalize on social learning by making sure that you recognize and acknowledge the peers who are doing what you want the target student to do. And that is able to serve as a corrective feature and kind of remind the student of the behaviors they should be engaging in that moment. So oftentimes you want to kind of recognize, acknowledge, and reinforce the peers. And that's what we mean by ongoing monitoring. Never forget to kind of keep ongoing monitoring of the class as a whole and not just the individual student, because you're missing opportunities for social learning by recognizing, acknowledging peers for doing the thing they should be doing. And that serves as a corrective function.
I find that it also keeps my mentality, if I'm looking for the positives while also using it as a technique to potentially change the undesired behavior, but it also gets me focusing on positive instead of just that behavior that I don't like, that may be a trigger that builds and builds and builds to a undesirable like overreaction from me as a teacher. So I've loved this one as well as a reminder also mindset wise of like focusing on positive while I'm giving myself time to think before I maybe make my next decision on how to deal with the behavior if it's not changing.
Yeah, giving yourself that stimulus response time before you react is often you want to tell yourself, do what's most effective, not what you immediately impulsively feel like saying and doing, because those initial reactions are often the things that are unskillful. So that, you know, providing yourself with that space is often helps one kind of get composure and understand if the behavior continues, what's my next step and how am I going to engage in that skillfully? Because the next step, I call it kind of like the temperature check. This is where you're going to prompt the student to do the expected behavior. And here it's really kind of what we call an effective direction. And effective directions are telling the student what to do. There's only one thing you say at a time, and it's a statement, not a question. Because you can imagine, you know, a parent wanting their kid to do something, and they say, "Are you ready for dinner yet?" And the kid's like, "No, what do you, get away from me, parent." Instead, what do you actually want the kid to do? Make it as a statement, not a question. You want to make sure it's positively statement. So it's not a don't, stop, or quit, because you're not telling the student what you expect them to do. You're basically outlining what they might get in trouble for. So you want to do it privately and in a way that's kind of non-threatening, because you're essentially assessing whether the kid's going to, you know, correct their behavior and get on track, or whether you might need to engage in a more skillful kind of communicative interaction, which is the last step, and that's the teaching interaction. So prior to a teaching interaction, sometimes students, you just want to give them a very kind of direct, non-threatening, private prompt to engage in that. Now, the teaching interaction is really kind of a sequence of three things, and there's skillful communication, but what we want to do with this is take an instance of problem behavior or unwanted behavior and allow the student to potentially learn from that. And the best way for them to learn is we're going to give them feedback and put them what we call a decisional dilemma and help them recognize they have a choice to be made. But we're supporting them to recognize that the choices that are under their control, and that either choice, there's consequences. And I don't mean consequence as bad. I mean consequences, things will happen after the choice. And so if the student decides to get their behavior back on track, there's a consequence for that. They can stay plugged in. If there was something bugging them, you might come around and check in with that to make that go away. If the student continues to engage in the problem behavior, then there could be a consequence with that. They might lose the opportunity to access something that they could have otherwise accessed. And so you could see the progression here from putting the kid into a decisional dilemma, giving them what we call think time to come up with their response, potentially delivering what we call an in-class disciplinary consequence, meaning they lost the opportunity to partake in something that they could have otherwise earned. And that's, setting limits and holding students accountable. None of this is about just letting students get away with anything they want. Effective correction is to help students recognize that their choices have implications for what they can access, potentially the things they can potentially earn. One really important caveat, though, is we never set up situations where we're saying, well, you're going to either earn or lose access to my care, or you're going to learn and lose access to basically basic human needs. And that's why effective correction is usually losing access to some type of privilege that could have been otherwise earned, some type of choice or independence that they could have otherwise earned, but not your care and concern, the ability to move about freely, food, fresh air. Those are the types of things where ineffective correction happens, and we start to, make kids feel like they're not liked anymore, they're not wanted, or we take away things that kind of deprive of their basic needs. The example would be taking away recess from a kid. And now a kid doesn't have any opportunity to really get that physical exercise, but that's kind of a basic human need that we want to grant. The last piece is what we call the office support. And so if the behavior progressed and something bigger might be going on with the student that would necessitate a solution-oriented process that goes above and beyond the teacher or the adult who's in charge of that setting, at one point you would request office support, and we call it office support instead of office referral because it is a support process and it's not necessarily a sanctioned punishment process. Typically, those on the back end would have some method to get at the root cause for why the kid's behavior problem's happening, generate a solution, and it also might mean that you couple that with a disciplinary consequence if the behavior was big enough or warranted such a measure. But in no way do we ever think that the disciplinary consequence alone is effective at teaching the student how to respond better next time when confronted with a similar situation. So those are kind of the three sequence. And when we get through all this, we recognize that even if we've been as skillful as possible in this interaction, because there are emotions on the line, that the kid could have perceived it as negative. They could perceive that you don't want them in the environment. They could perceive that you're not trying to understand something about them. So we know that we have to connect any correction to a potential restorative interaction on the back end to make sure all is good. And we often equip people with 5 different communication techniques that represent ways of restoring and repairing any potential harm to the relationship on the back end. When it comes to an office support process, we usually take those forms we use to track office referral or support, and there's a section on the bottom where the process comes full circle back to the referring adult, and they're going to indicate when and what restorative communication strategy they selected. So essentially, any office referral or support form is really a way of providing a checklist to ensure that the adults are engaging in as effective interactions with the student from in the classroom to when removal occurred, from what the administrator or administrative representative's doing for a solution, and then what's happening when we're trying to reintegrate the student back into the environment in terms of the restorative interaction. And that's a really critical piece.
Yes, I think there's 2 powerful things, just thinking and listening to try to, as the moderating this. One is the idea of the powerful use of checklists. I think about the book, The Checklist Manifesto, and how it talks about anything super complicated, how do you make sure that it works? Well, it's like a pilot flying an airplane in a situation where something's not going well. There's probably hundreds and hundreds of steps that they have to potentially know that might go back to their training. Well, in that moment, there's no way that they're going to be able to remember those 100. So they have the checklist of here are the 7 steps, or here are the 5 steps in order that will trigger that other training and background. So I think about the powerful use of checklists, but also the powerful of your system. What does your system look like when it comes to this, and how do you have it set up? And so that we are better responding. Because I think this part is big. It's like, well, I did the whole thing and I was skillful in doing it, but it's like, yes, but if we get to teacher interaction, there is that work of restoring that relationship. So what are we doing to restore? And there's lots of different methods that we can, but what's then that work and the importance of, if we don't have it as a part of our system and or using things like checklists, it most likely is not going to happen.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly correct. We have to create kind of the prompts and reminder systems, and that's what a checklist, and that's, I honestly look at as an office referral form. It has two kind of purposes. One, it's kind of that checklist that reminds us of the actions, the skillful actions we should be taking when students engage in problem behavior. And so it goes full circle, but it also is useful data for decision-making purposes. We can look at what are the most common problems, in what setting, what time of the day, and you can use that for school-wide improvement efforts as well. But this idea of restore, is just in my mind, and I'll always get around to doing it. We know people often miss the opportunities to do it if there's not some type of support. And this isn't like evaluative, or it just supports people need to make sure we follow through with the effective practices when we're cool, calm, and collected, we know are important to, use with students.
Great.
So, I'm going to get to the actual teaching interaction. So this is really about skillful communication. And the best way to react to any human's problem behavior is to always lead in with an empathy statement. And the goal here is to help the person understand that you're trying to understand their perspective. The best way to start an empathy, to generate an empathy statement, is to ask an open-ended question. And sometimes it's as simple as what's up. And, if we're thinking about secondary age students, a lot of times you might get nothing. Sometimes you could get, some type of emotional laden response, like this is unfair, or this class sucks, or I'm bored out of my mind, or, I don't want to do this. And that is all awesome fodder to start to think about what can be an empathy statement, because all of us have experienced intense boredom where we wanted to not do something that was in front of us, or all of us have, experienced certain situations that we think are, not cool, or you feel kind of disrespected, and that's not cool. In no way is an empathy statement, agreeing with the behavior, but it's greasing the wheels for an interaction, because you're showing that you're seeking to understand their feelings, their perspective, or the motive underlying the behavior.
I think I know too. Sorry, Clay. If you read that, that's on us. You had a good one, but when we translated it over, I think we have. So just recognize the typos on us.
So generally, I mean, whatever it is, you can come up with 100 different scenarios. And we often, if you're going to really get good at this, you have to practice these kind of empathy statements. So create a scenario, kids, using their technology inappropriate in the classroom, and you go to, talk to them about it, and you say, what's going on? And they say, well, there's something important I have to, something important I have to tell someone. Now you got something to have an empathy statement. Have you ever had the urge that you had to say something really important to someone and you didn't think it could wait? And so that gives me something to have empathy. And I have to go not only in the student's shoes, but back into my shoes and recognize, when was there a time I felt a similar way? And now I need to communicate that to the student. I get it. You feel like you really have to communicate that. And if it is really, really important, I want to be able to come back and talk to you with you about it and maybe give you the opportunity. Here's the deal, though. Right now you're doing X behavior, and that behavior is having an impact in this way. And so we usually follow the empathy statement, not with a but or however. It's usually an and, or here's the deal, or it's just a continuation, because we don't want to undermine our empathy statement. We want to say, I'm not cool with you feeling like you really have to, it's important to share something and you don't think there's an opportunity, because if I feel that way, it's hard for me to focus and get past that until I do it. Here's the deal, though. Your behavior right now, the other students around you aren't able to get their work done, and it's distracting to them. And that's, the thing I'm trying to, get back on track. And what I want you to do instead is, you provide a rationale for the appropriate behavior.
Yeah.
You go from the correct sequence here is start with an empathy statement, label the inappropriate, then we label the appropriate behavior instead. What we need you to do for time being is put the technology down and start working. And here's why I would like you to do that. If you're able to do that, I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to find out what's going on and perhaps provide you with that opportunity in a way that is less distracting to your students and to other students. So you would start with an empathy. We go empathy. We label the inappropriate behavior and how it's having an impact. We label the appropriate behavior to do instead, and we give them a rationale.
We'll make that switch too, Clay. Before we send it out, we'll clean up that part that we missed there.
Yeah. Yep. And then, the last part is to help the student to recognize that they actually do have choices. And a lot of students, they get kind of in a pickle because they think they only have one way out. But so part of the learning opportunity here is to help them recognize that there's a variety of choices to make. And some of those choices are actually better choices to make in the situation than others. And so we often like to outline 3 choices. You can get back to doing the work so it doesn't have an impact. If you really need to just take a moment and get your composure, you can do that as well. And one choice is to continue to do the problem behavior and distract your peers. And each one of those is going to have a consequence in terms of, what we're going to follow up on. And you give the student think time. And the think time is to kind of give them space and a little bit of time. We often say like 20 to 30 seconds to kind of, hopefully, if they're activated, to come to their senses a little bit and see the virtues in particular decisions. And then we come back and we ask them what their choice is. And now we're in a position of giving them feedback. Feedback could go in a couple of ways. The feedback could be like praise and recognizing the student for making a desired choice. Or the feedback could mean you lose the opportunity to earn something that they could have otherwise earned because the student has continued to, engage in the problem behavior and distract peers, which is why it's having a negative impact. And so you start progressing down that. If the behavior corrects itself after you deliver the in-class kind of response, then you're done. If it continues, now you're getting closer to the point where the student's behavior may necessitate some type of solution to figure out what's going on. We're not removing the kid because we want them to come in contact with punishment. We're actually requesting office support. In a lot of schools, the system we build is the office support comes to the classroom. It's not the kid walking to the hallway. It's the office support comes to the classroom. The person checks in with the teacher to say, hey, do you really just need a little bit of coverage while you extend this dialogue with the student? Or do you have something? Would you like us to, continue the conversation and get at kind of the root cause for what's going on with the student so we can find a solution? And that's where that handoff gets made. But anytime we remove a kid due to behavior, we have potentially created a negative situation in terms of the student's perceptions. And that's why the restorative interaction on the back end becomes critical. So when we get good at this, we get really good at leading into these interactions in kind of a private way, but leading in with an empathy statement. Once we've had the empathy statement and recognize, imagine the kid says, nobody likes me, everybody hates me and doesn't want me in this class. The initial empathy statement would be, feeling that way is not, I don't want you to feel that way in my class. It's not cool for any student to feel that way. And I want to know why you're thinking that way and what I might be able to do to help out. Here's the deal, though. When your behavior was X, imagine the kid did something and confronted another student by calling them a name. And then what you want them to do is to be able to, just get back to their desk, get back on work, or take a little time for themselves in a chill out spot, or they can continue to have kind of make negative statements towards their peers. you want to, in the empathy statement, you want to indicate that you're not okay with kids feeling a certain way. And if they're able to get their behavior back on track, you're going to follow back up with them, because nobody wants a kid to think that class is unfair or that it's boring out of their mind. And the adult has an opportunity to say how they're going to circle back and work with the student. And so that engages them in their interaction and keeps them in a learning position versus a place where we go too quick to correction or a warning, and we actually activate the student's fight or flight response, and they either disengage further or they rear up and start to, kind of more overtly engage in other types of externalizing behaviors, arguing, defiance, making verbal statements that people can consider disrespectful. So when we come full circle, the standardized teaching interaction is called a teaching interaction because you're taking that instance and you're trying to create a learning opportunity for the student. The learning opportunity is preserved by leading in with the empathy statement, laying out the choices the student can make, and helping them understand the consequences associated with each of those choices, and putting them in a position to come up with their choice on their own. And that's that decisional dilemma coupled with think time. And so when we do this with certain students, the more repetitions you might need to do with students who have higher levels of need, the more learning trials. So it becomes a method of teaching. And as we know, the more times we repeat a teaching, the more likely it's eventually going to stick in, and we help alter students' behavior patterns from engaging in problem behavior to more consistently engaging in expected behavior that, contributes to a more orderly, productive, safe, and effective learning environment for all.
Good. So good, Clay. Thank you. I'm getting messages on the side about how valuable this is to people, how great it is to hear not only some of the bigger picture pieces, and I love even how you framed this today. It's like, before we even get going, can we just acknowledge human nature? And that is, anytime we correct behavior, it's not going to be an easy situation, right? So if we already acknowledge that, and then it's like, well, how do we get more effective in what we're doing? And we go from both kind of the big picture of not only from the student lens, but also what we need to be doing ourselves and the work we need to be doing internally, not only as the educators, but just as human beings with how we deal, because behavior is all around us. But then that very practical, what are ways through that prompt method that I could be more effective in my classroom or in the hallway or in any situation in a school. So knowing time-wise, if you're okay with it, I want to do a couple quick fire questions your way, knowing that none of them are always like easy, but I've got probably about, we'll see how many we get through here, but some.
Yeah, let's do it.
And answer them as concise as you can. It also could be directing people to a resource, or, hey, I can send something that we could always like follow up and include that in the resources if you feel like that's more effective. So a couple of times people ask, do you have a sample of the office referral form kind of that you're mentioning? I'd love to compare and contrast to what we're currently using. Where would you recommend?
Yeah, no, I'll send it to you, John, and then you all can blast it out. Yeah, we have one where we've taken what we can, for positive behavior intervention supports or SWIS, what might be one that has all the components of it that you would want to track good data. We've altered it to include sections for restorative interaction, so that process comes full circle, and it becomes kind of that checklist that goes from the referring adult to the administrative designee who engages in solution-oriented kind of problem solving, all the way back to the referring adult so they can indicate how they restored the relationship with the student. And then we train people to be able to do each step within that kind of referral form. But I'll send that to you, and that could easily be shared.
Perfect. Our team will make a note of that so we don't forget it, including
I'll forget. I guarantee a lot of things and forget to send them.
Yeah. And then also to fix the slide there so that it's correct in the teaching interaction, because people have been asking, like, can I get my hands on these slides? And so then the next is, someone asked, is it better to use 3 choices rather than 2? I think that was a specific part when you were sharing. Do you remember where that might have connected?
Yeah, the third choice option, it really requires that I first set up the environment where kids might have a composure spot. You call them chill down spots. In elementary class, we call them go to Hawaii for a little bit. And Hawaii has things they can access that might be self-soothing. Yep. But it's helping students be able to advocate. If you're not in a place to get it back, then what you want to do is engage in a decision that's still better than continuing the problem behavior, because you're no longer. So it's kind of a take some time and go. Now, if that's not, sometimes we do just set up a kind of a 2 decision. Well, you can do this or that. But if there are kind of situations where the environment permits potential 3 choices, we lay them out and we indicate, for example, like, there could be a best choice. The best choice is you still stay plugged into the work. You're able to get your behavior back on track, and you're still stay fully participating. The next best choice would be if you need to take some time to gain your composure to come back, that's cool. And we're going to put a little kind of timer on that, but I'm going to allow you to make that choice. That's better than, and you could still continue to the problem behavior. Here's, ultimately why it might not be in your best interest. So you got 3 choices. The choice is yours. And if you need, any help with engaging in those choices, let me know, but I'm going to give you a little bit of time to chew on it. So there's nothing that says it has to be 3.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. How about this? Someone said, when you request office support, what are the steps or options after that?
So yeah, this is where, we could do a whole webinar on what does effective office support look like. You need a paradigm that enables someone to get and develop a hypothesis and work with the student and around what is the root cause for why the problem behavior occurred. And so we often give, the paradigm we use is we use the acquisition performance paradigm. The reason why the kid is not doing the work is because the kid's being demanded to do something that they don't have the skills to do. That means they have an acquisition need, because you can imagine a kid tells its teacher to F off, like F you. But the kid's repeatedly being asked to do something they can't do, and they use FU to essentially communicate that they can't do it. They're missing a skill that the environment's demanding them to perform, and that's why they said FU. Now, that's an unskilled way to communicate, but they don't have the language repertoire to tell the teacher that I have an acquisitional need and you need to mobilize remedial instruction to teach to my skill deficits. Instead, they just say FU. Another is it's due to a performance deficit. That means the environment's improperly encouraging, supporting, and motivating to get the kid to use their knowledge and skills that they're fully capable of using. And parts that relationship problems are part of what encourage and support and motivate a kid to use their behavior. So you might, within a performance need, might need to be a need to improve relationship between the adult and the kid. The solution becomes tailored to whatever the hypothesized root cause is. So versus just sanction and figuring out how much detention or what we're going to do to the kid to get them to learn about the wrongs in their ways, we're thinking about what's actually at the root cause for the problem behavior, what solution best matches that root cause, and we consider whether a disciplinary consequence is needed. And that disciplinary consequence is exploring what type of privilege or thing that they could have otherwise earned access to are they going to miss out on due to the behavior. And that's where we're it's like if my daughter does something that's irresponsible and she's driving a car, she's going to lose access to the car keys for a little bit. It's naturally and logically related. There's a loss, but I'm also working with her to develop a plan on how to avoid having this happen again. And that's kind of the solution part of that.
It's good. Quick firing, continuing. How about this? On a positive side, it says, I know relationships are the best way to have a positive effect on behavior. Is there something I can share with our teachers for, in quotes, on the fly help in the classroom with kids that perhaps they don't have strong relationships developed yet?
Yeah, so we've developed what's called the Establish, Maintain, Restore methodology. It's in Character Strong, and Character Strong has a bunch of proactive relational strategies that it's not just building relationship on the back end once something's happened. but it's more on the front end. What can you do at a time when there is no problem behavior that's for the sole purpose of cultivating relationships? There's things, like banking time, and there's a variety of lists of those types of techniques and strategies that teachers can utilize. What we do is help teacher typically reflect on the relationship status with kids, identify those kids for whom they need to be very intentional about, and then they find opportunities or windows of time to exhibit those concrete relational practices to ensure that they're cultivating a sense of relationship with students. So on the back end, you're able to leverage that, or what we call withdraw from the relationship when it comes time to correcting or motivating certain types of behavior.
And just just very practical things of like right now, one, obviously, the whole idea of like 4 at the door plus 1 more, that intentional greeting at the door, having something ready for them to do when they come in that is explicitly built into your routine so you don't have to get their attention again. Like that is very practical because it's the ongoing connection point. But then one of the very most practical things that I've heard recently is, we call it the student becomes the master. Give every student a note card as they come in, ask them to write down as a part of their next entry task, what is one thing that you can teach me as your teacher? Because what they're going to put on that card is something that they're either skilled at, knowledgeable about, or passionate about. And I may not use every one of those cards because I might already have relationships built with many of my students. But what about, this student? And this student puts something on there that I could go and do a little bit of background, work on learning a little bit about, and then the next day come in and ask that student a question about it, unrelated to school, as an immediate small win to start to build a relationship or a stronger relationship with a student that I don't have it developed with yet, if you're looking for very practical there.
Yeah, totally.
How about this? How do we deal with passive aggressive behaviors or defiance? What would be the first kind of quick fire answer that would come to mind, knowing that none of these are ever simple or just easy?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's the methodology to really get a student off of a kind of a pattern of negative problem behavior onto other behavior is we have to always ask ourselves, have we taught the alternative replacement behaviors? So anytime we're reacting to certain problem behavior, so if I take my daughter to Target and she tantrums and whines because I didn't buy her something, I could say it's her mom's jeans, or that she's a ungrateful little kid. Or I could say, ask myself, did I ever teach her the behaviors, the alternative behaviors that she should be in response to that environment where there's all kinds of things she wants right at her eyeball level? So the methodology to get a student off of what we call defiance and noncompliance, and it could be disruptive, potentially offensive and other types, is to make sure we're teaching the alternative behaviors, and we're not only teaching, but we're creating opportunities to reinforce and recognize students if they use those behaviors instead of the problem behaviors. And then we're also creating a situation in which we're skillfully correcting using the teaching interaction if we've exhausted the precursor strategies, whereby we're putting the kid in a decisional dilemma, and there's gonna be a response cost. That behavior is gonna mean that the student's gonna lose the opportunity to earn access to something that they should otherwise earn access to. And the thing they're not gonna lose is our care and love. The ability to access and move about freely, so you have to create things that the kid can earn in terms of privileges and things that make sense. So when it comes time and they keep doing the problem behavior, the defiance or the passive aggressive behavior, it's going to mean that the kid's going to lose access to something. So that behavior has less worth and value. Meanwhile, you've taught them alternative behaviors they can use in similar situations that you're going to recognize and reinforce, so those behaviors take on greater value. But sticking with it and consistency with repetition is really the key to moving kids off of problem behaviors onto more positive behaviors.
That's great. Thank you. How about this? How would you handle a student that refuses consequences after making bad choices?
Yeah, so the refuses consequences is you just got to prohibit access. And so we often think about there's not opportunities to partake in potential privileges that could otherwise have been earned.
Yeah.
And so you got to create a range of different privileges. That don't mean taking away just recess or the opportunity to do stuff, but a range of privileges that students could access in an environment that provide choice opportunities, free time opportunities, the ability to engage in certain types of social activities. And we have a list of, it's hard within this kind of scope of time, but we often have to work with people on creating those on the front end, because those are the things to earn. So on the back end, when it comes time to delivering in-class disciplinary consequences, you actually have things to restrict access to. And so it's not about the kid not wanting to comply, they just don't get to access. And meanwhile, if they, the high schoolers or middle schoolers are, legendary for saying, well, I don't care. You don't put your sail in their wind because they say they don't care. We know if it's something that they want to access and they like, that it is actually going to ultimately, the repetition of losing access to that. Meanwhile, the teaching and the solution-oriented supports, we're not just taking away stuff. We're also trying to support and come up with plans so they don't have to repeat that again in the future, starts to chisel away and have an impact on the student's behavior. It just takes kind of the adults being consistent in delivering that over time.
It's good. A couple more. People are hanging with us. I'm watching the count, so people have stayed in. A couple more questions. How about this? Person says, this is really helpful. I'm wondering your thoughts. And you might have already addressed this, so redirect us, Clay, if it's like, hey, this is what we talked about with the teaching interaction. But it's really helpful. I'm wondering your thoughts about teaching the students how to respond differently, more of a teachable moment and restorative approach. What would you redirect them back to? They might have had to jump out early, but would you say it's in that teaching interaction, or what would you add to that?
No, I mean, this is the proactive, so I had the model, the proactive, the teaching, and the reactive. Yep. You got to double down on teaching. The question is always, when are you teaching the full range of skills and behaviors for students to get their needs met in a more socially appropriate? So when they feel like they want to avoid and they really aren't in a place to do work, what are the behaviors the adults have taught them that they could use and are willing to accept them using when they really feel like that they can't do it? Or what are the appropriate ways they can request getting attention in class? And when you have kids with high attentional needs and they feel the urge to interact with others and the activity or environment's not yet permitting that. So it's like you always got to go back to the proactive teaching strategies, and the reactive strategies should be connected to that, to the things we're teaching and supporting and proactively encouraging students to exhibit on a daily basis. Absent of proactive supports to encourage and prompt and pre-correct and the teaching strategies, reactive strategies become way, way, way more challenging.
It's good. Thank you. Quick fire, almost done. It says manipulation. Behavior is attention seeking, but once the attention is given, it is manipulated. What are some strategies I can use to help empower this student to want to get positive feedback?
So, I mean, it's creating opportunities. This would be create students pro-social opportunities to get the attention, teach them the skills on how to, within those opportunities and get it, and make sure you kind of, celebrate the success. When the student engages, because so imagine a kid engages in negative attention-seeking behavior. It's inherently reinforcing to them. Even though it's kind of problematic, it instigates, it riles people up, it creates more problems, but it's reinforcing to the kid. What you have to do is create a situation where even though that's reinforcing, it's going to cause them to lose out on other social activities that they could have otherwise earned. There is going to be a response cost. Even though they engaged in that, they're going to be, that behavior will be paired with losing access to something else that could have otherwise been earned that's equally or more reinforcing. Then you're also creating these opportunities for the kid to take on kind of pro-social leadership or engage in pro-social interactions with others, so the kid can start getting that taste and flavor for, pro-social behavior instead of what some of the antisocial behavior patterns we see certain kids get stuck in.
Awesome. This is so good, Clay. I really appreciate it. I know that we're over your time as well. I just have two final ones. Let's see. Maybe a little bit of a curveball, but I'd love to get just your initial thoughts. So it says, we are having a serious increase in the number of students vaping. It is occurring at it's taking a large amount of our administrative time. Just thoughts on that. I know you've probably seen this. Obviously, it's behavior. What are your thoughts on that?
Anytime I put it back into the same model. So what we're going to do is we're going to teach model, cue, reinforce the behaviors we want. So healthy choices, we're going to teach what those are. We're going to reinforce and recognize those. And if students are doing them, we're not going to make them feel unwanted and stuff, but they're going to lose access to other things they could otherwise earn. We also got to create and recognize that certain students have higher levels of needs, and it becomes kind of a chemical dependency problem. Schools can't, educators need to broaden and become the hub of access for other supports and services that kids might need, because they might not be able to take it on themselves, but they can sure be a location where students are going to be able to access other types of supports, in particular for kids who have a bona fide kind of addiction problem when it comes to, nicotine. And we have plenty of, kids have reached that level, and it's not just kind of a choice that you can easily flip on and off, but it's rather a support that, an individual needs to get that under control. So there's ways in which we can handle it school-wide in terms of bringing in and teaching healthy choices and the reasons why, and modeling those ourselves and recognizing, reinforcing those. And then the second piece is to recognize certain kids are going to have a need to access more intensive supports, and we have to make those available when needed.
Good. Last question, and then I'm going to share two compliments to you and a final thought. Says, because it's always a piece, at the high school level, two of our biggest problems are tardies, unexcused absences. What are your suggestions on how to effectively address this at the high school level? We know this includes systems-wide, but just what would be a couple of just first thoughts on that, or redirect them or bring them back to something that you shared today?
Yeah, I mean, the overly simplified but an effective way to think about it is that kids don't show up based on what's on the other side of the door. And so we always have to say, what's on the other side of the door? So going back to that idea of what's at the root cause for this, for many kids, it's on what's on the other side of the door. Why does a kid show up to one class but not another? Why is a kid chronically late? And so we know the relationship. Sometimes the subject matter could be more difficult, and the environment might not be as engaging and fun. And so we have to always recognize that when we have kids who are missing, we got to make it a more reinforcing and motivating place to be. That can be done relationally, and it's also done based on the experiences students access once they are on the other side of the door. Because it's, what's very telling is, students who don't show up in certain environments but are willing to show up in others, and you can start to dissect some of the differences, and it leads to potential solutions that are missing in other environments. So one way to think about that is to what's the relationship? How reinforcing and motivating are the experiences on the other side of the door? And then we have also kids who are chronically dealing with other stuff. But I'm talking to school-wide. And then we have other kids who might have bona fide anxiety problems that are preventing them from showing up to school. And that their root cause is inability to manage and cope with anxiety. We have kids with depression. That's why schools, from a multi-tiered perspective, have to create a continuum of supports kids can access based on need. So when we think about it, we do these really healthy, effective things for all kids who continue to express a need. We also have a method of getting at the root cause for why they continue to have that need, so we can tailor a service or support that's more precisely wedded to why they're struggling. Good.
Yeah, we talk even on just the foundational level of that changing the definition of school spirit from being about the rah and who's showing up to activities or things, which really is about 10% of the student population. But what if we change the definition of school spirit to creating a place, a school where all students and staff want to come versus feel like they have to come? What would it take if that had to be your definition? And you would have to go all in, double down on that work that you're doing to create that strong foundation, tier one, and all of these pieces are connected to that. And it's hard, purposeful work, but the payoff is huge. Clay, thank you so much. I'm going to end just a couple of final things. One, someone said, thank you for addressing our personal, end quote, bias when it comes to students. This is something I've just recently started thinking specifically about, because of course no one thinks that they have bias, right? But I think it's so important, and I appreciate you shining a light on it today. Another person said, this has been so helpful. I truly look forward to more webinars, classes such as these that you provided this important cause. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And then finally, as always, a question came up today, and I'll just respond to it with our thanks, Clay, to you. And by the way, if you have interest in more, we are doing a next webinar on April 8th from 12 to 1 p.m. Pacific time. It's on how to build a common language with your staff. Houston and I will be leading that one. Also, if you ever want to set up a call to talk more about different pieces, you can use this link. This is a great way to directly get on our calendar. We talk with principals, teachers, superintendents, curriculum directors, you name it, every week when it comes to the work and learning more about how we might be able to support you. But this line, I think, stood out because leadership matters. And a lot of times we'll be doing this work, but attitude reflects leadership. And it says, unfortunately, I've worked with people in positions of leadership, maybe administrators, that have stated they do not know how to build relationships with students and do not take the time to learn. In terms of discipline, we know building a positive relationship is the foundational piece in effective discipline and behavior change. How do we get our leaders on board? And I think one of those things is the people who are in positions of leadership to then provide our principals, our building leaders, the people that are in those positions, just like teachers with students, but are we providing them the training that they need? Are we providing them the relational piece, not just how do you evaluate or how do you do these systems part, and setting it up as there's a big difference between leadership and management. We manage things in systems, we lead people. And are we giving our leaders the leadership development, the people side of things that they need? And I just felt called to this. I asked Lindsay to grab this for me, who's off to the side. And I really love Danny Steele's work. He's a principal out of Alabama. And he just wrote a recent book, Danny Steele and Todd Whitaker. And I love this first line in the preface. It says, everything comes down to leadership. When things are going well in a school, it comes down to the leader. When things are not going so well in the school, it comes down to the leader, period. And it was like, we have to do the work as building leaders to be setting that example. And if we're not relational or out there, and I still remember the time I was in a huge school in another state, and it was this like student-wide leadership conference, and the principal gets on stage, and the kid that's sitting next to me isn't even directly talking to me, he just says it out of habit, and he goes, oh, that's what our principal looks like. And I'm like, what grade are you in? Like, he just was saying it, and he's like, I'm a senior. And he was honestly saying, that's what my principal looks like. And we have to fight back against that. Administrators, people that are leading our teachers, and we have to set that example of the relationships. At the core, all of this comes down to relationships. Thank you, Clay, for your time today. It's been awesome. Looking forward to continue work with you. Hope you have a great day in the balmy 42 degrees.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a good one, man.
All right, take care.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.